So, hello everybody who is now slowly but surely dropping in. My name is Melanie and I'm moderating this session. But very soon give over the word to Kersty, our guest today for the Brownback lecture. I'm still waiting for some people to show up, so maybe 1 minute more, and because Zoom always decides to make an update when you are late. But so we are about to start soon. And I'm going to first introduce why we thought a Brownback lecture on circular consumption and people in circular society, or the human actor in circular society, is an interesting issue. We had already a discussion, a workshop on a kind of ideal type Homo circularis in this morning, where we had a very diversified discussion on what the role of people is, how can they participate, or how do they want to participate, and how can they be enabled to do all these things that are expected from them in the circular economy or circular society. And I'm very happy that we have today Kersty Hobson here, who is at the School of Geography and Planning in Cardiff, at Cardiff University. She already also worked in Australia before, and she is, since a long time, you can say, very much engaged or researching about sustainable consumption and production and the circular economy in the last 10 years or so. I remember that I read my first article of Kersty Hobson in the beginning of 2002 or something about discourses and discourses on sustainable consumption and the consumer pictures, and I really like this critical perspective and the depth of thoughts in these articles. And then, since then I've been reading almost all the papers, so I'm a fangirl here. So I'm giving over the word to Kersty. She will lecture for like half an hour, and then we have a quarter hour for questions. Feel free to post your questions in the chat in between, so I'm trying to integrate them in the end, or some people find the time to answer before. That also happens sometimes. So now, Kersty, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that really nice welcome. I now realise, yes, that I can't hide the fact that I've been doing this for 20 years. So that's quite a shock for me as well. And I will share my screen in a minute. And I suppose in a way of sort of apology if you've had these discussions already this morning, my teaching responsibilities and also lack of German has meant I was not able to participate. Growing up in North Wales, we spoke Welsh and French in school, not German, so I'm afraid I'm quite ignorant there. So if I'm repeating things you already have heard and discussed and know, I am sorry for that, but hopefully we'll get to the point where we can have some interesting discussion. So I'll share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that now. So the title that would have been in the programme was Circular Consumption. And I've gone and added, arbitrarily, my own little sort of secondary bit to that, which is or not ? What sort of foundational transition for what sort of circular economy? And you'll see there's 2 question marks there, and that's on purpose because I consider sort of my role here is to contribute to your ongoing discussions rather than necessarily just kind of present a paper and say, that's it, I'm done. And sort of walk away. And I hope to be able to come into some of the sessions tomorrow, the ones that were in English. So I'm just going to start from basics because obviously I don't know what you know and what you've discussed per se. And you'll have seen this diagram. This is the famous butterfly diagram from Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We don't need to spend a lot of time, of course, on this. And all I'm trying to point out is that, as you'll see, all roads, all cascades lead to the consumer and the user, and all loops go back around and back down to the cascades. So that obviously puts us as the consumer and user as absolutely central to any sense of the circular economy. I also noticed this morning that those kind of little representations of the consumer and user are quite strange. I think they could have done better there. Anyway. And again, you've probably seen this just to think a bit more about, well, what does that mean if we are the central actors and all cascades and loops come to and from us? What are we actually talking about in terms of the things that we're being asked to do? So this is you might have seen this. This is from, again, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And just to say, I'm offering their work up not because I think it is kind of the archetype of where we all should be heading, but rather because it has become obviously quite a main player in terms of the discourses around the circular economy. So this is the acrostic called Resolve, which is basically where they try and break down the different sort of actions that need to happen to create a circular economy. And really, you and I in our everyday lives were implicated more in the share bit. So the S there, sharing assets, reusing secondhand, prolonging goods and services. And we're also implicated more in the virtualize. So using online services, books, music, travel. I'm not quite sure how autonomous vehicles come into that, but anyway. So we have a role to play, and it is obviously more around, as those loops suggest, reusing, etc., etc. Okay, so we know all that. And one of the things that, I got into this area because obviously this is where the discourse of sustainable consumption was heading in the kind of about sort of 10 years or so ago. And I was very curious as to who this figure at the bottom of the cascades and the loops and everything, who this is, who this kind of ideal type, or who we're being set up to be. And of course, we know these things are very important because the foundational conceptual assumptions you make about how people think and how change happens then leads you to certain actions. So if we're on shaky conceptual foundations, everything that follows might be problematic. And it struck me very early that for all these loops and cascades leading to and from the consumer user, talk in the mainstream policies, in particularly Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which really was the main thing. Obviously now there's more stuff coming out of the EU and other actors. But it was a bit of an afterthought. You couldn't really find a lot initially talking about the consumer user in the circular economy. But it did seem to me, and it still very much is the case, that there's a paradoxical figure that's emerged in terms of how we might think of the circular consumer. So on the one hand, they, you, I, sorry, a bit of a hoarse throat, are able and willing to swap our consumption choices out for more circular options. So, we could be nudged by product labeling, there could be an incentive, and it's really about making business models and the services and the products on offer better than what's there already. So staying very much, within that sort of economic frame of a consumer. So in terms of how the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, etc., were talking about this, that seemed quite unproblematic. It's just, well, if we make it bigger, better, faster, stronger, the consumer user will take it up naturally. But of course, then we have to stop and say, what does this assume? It assumes that we can actually make all goods and services bigger, faster, stronger, and all of that, and keep it within the current economic norms and systems and make it work. And if we look at the sort of last 10 years of research into this in terms of the uptake by consumers of more circular ways of consuming and practices, there's a lot of issues there, and we can come back to that. Particularly, my own research has shown with electronics, big problem around the uptake of any different types of business models. So on the one hand, you've got this kind of, homo economist kind of consumer who's willing to look at market signals and buy the best thing on offer. But on the other hand, there is a lot of hidden assumptions in the circular economy that we're all willing and able to take on what we could call the consumption work of new forms of material relations. So I've been doing some work with Catherine Wheeler, whose book there with Marion Glucksmann talked about the idea of how consumption work, and what they mean by that is the kind of labour that we all do as part of the economic system. So it might be scanning your own groceries in the supermarket, it might be going to IKEA and getting the flat pack something and building it yourself. That markets rely on us doing labour, not necessarily for them. It's not about who is responsible. It's not necessarily a normative argument. It just is the fact that we undertake forms of labour, and without that, these particular goods and services could not exist. IKEA would not be what it is today if we all weren't willing to take flat pack home and then go through the living hell of trying to put together a cupboard. So there's an assumption there that actually on the one hand, the circular economy is all very unproblematic for us. The market will take care of us, we'll buy the best thing. But on the other hand, all the things that go with that, for example, giving up your car and car sharing, undertaking forms of voluntarism like participating in repair cafes, that's all fine. That's all kind of part of the equation. So those two things don't really add up that well. And when you look back into the Ellen MacArthur Foundation work, it is very much framed as a win-win, that this is only a good thing for the consumer, which when we think about consumption work as a genuine practice, then that becomes problematic. Okay, so we know that. But things have moved on. Things have moved on since the Ellen MacArthur Foundation started to kind of lay the territory for what the circular economy might be considered. And it's become a lot more sort of interesting in many ways. So I've been looking more recently at policies and various pronouncements coming out, and the European Green Deal is very interesting, of course. I mean, I'm obviously now living in a country that is no longer part of Europe, but I'm in denial about that. So I still consider myself a European. That's fine, always will. Hopefully one day we'll get back in. But anyway, that aside, if you look at the European Green Deal, I was curious how the consumer is framed in that. And as you can see from this quite long quote here, it is very much around products and services. So businesses to offer and allow consumers to choose reusable, durable and repairable products, analyse the need for the right to repair, etc., etc. Consumer policy will help to empower consumers to make informed choices, new business models, and all of that. And I'm not sitting here being, sarcastic and difficult about that fact. That's all very good. That's good. But one of the things that does strike me is that where most of the impact of our consumption is on travel, housing, food, it's not, food maybe, but certainly travel and housing, those are kind of the main sectors, and they're not really highlighted. You would think reading that, you were talking about your mobile phone or your toaster. And again, that is fine, but it seems to be sidestepping where our main impacts is. And one of the things that also has struck me reading these documents is this idea of empowering consumers. And I was thinking to myself, what does that actually mean? We hear that term and we use that term, and I wonder if that really is the best goal. So what do I mean by that? Well, I did the kind of really basic thing you do, when you're trying to get your head around a concept, and I looked about what do we mean by empower? So, of course, that can mean give somebody the authority, like a right, you have the authority, you are empowered to do a particular thing. This is often around sort of legal standing. We're talking a little bit about that in terms of right to repair, but really, when the term is used in this context, it's talking about making us all a bit stronger and more confident in terms of our own consumption choices. And I find that quite a curious way to think of us all, of consumers, because I don't know about you, but often when you enter into a consumption sort of practice or a place where you're about to consume, your own empowerment isn't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind. There are so many other things going on. And it struck me that really, when I look at all the more recent documents about, the green recovery, etc., what I've called here the sacred cow of consumer sovereignty has gone unquestioned. So we still haven't got to the point, no matter all this talk of transitions, etc., where we actually are willing to take out this idea of consumer sovereignty and to look at it quite critically. And that really is the idea that the consumer is king or queen, and that actually the markets are just responding to what you and I want. But we know that that is not the case at all. We know that false needs are created. We know that we all have imperfect information, etc. So that is problematic. And one of the things that is never taken into account are things like the rebound effect. So I put that just that screenshot there from The Guardian about rebound effects and climate efforts. And I think I've become a bit obsessed with rebound effects, really, because it just strikes me more and more that if we ignore that, then we are really just missing like 50% or whatever of the picture. And I put that other picture on the right because I hear quite regularly the argument that actually, if people can hire and rent and lease things, therefore that will displace them buying things. Well, actually, the evidence suggests that is not happening. So, for example, if you are renting a high-end piece of clothing that you can go to a ball when we're all allowed to actually meet each other again, that actually is displacing you going out to a shop and buying that. What the evidence shows is actually it's on top of it. So people are going about their normal consumption patterns and practices. And look, now you can have a fantastic Vera Wang gown for £50 for a night or whatever. So why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you then return it and do that? So what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of thinking that kind of stops at the basics and says, okay, well, people can rent, therefore that's good because it means they're not buying. Well, actually, they are still buying. So without actually then questioning, again, that idea of consumer sovereignty and that idea of our own consumption, it remains highly problematic. I know there's a lot on this slide, sorry. And I just recently came across another report. And it's very interesting, called A System Change Compass, Implementing the European Green Deal in the Time of Recovery. And this came out not that long ago. And the Club of Rome was involved. So that's a very kind of prestigious and interesting organization. And the reason I'm talking about this is because it's pushing the thinking beyond just tinkering. So the report actually is focused on this system change compass. And what it's trying to do is describe the transformations that are required across the whole of society for to change our socio-economic systems. So it's really trying to take a good hard look at, okay, no more of this business as usual, no more of tweaking. If we mean transformations, then we have to think about how to make that reality. And what this report argued, so there on the right there, that graph, you can see the different areas that they're saying needs to be redefined. So you have prosperity, resource use, metrics, and of course, consumption. And the report then goes on to reset the foundational premises that can be translated into policy orientations and instruments. Again, a really good read, very interesting stuff in there. But when you look at what they're talking about in terms of the redefining consumption, I would argue that actually even that is not going to help reset the foundational premises of our consumption. So you probably haven't read the report, that's fine. So I'll just explain a little bit what I mean. So when they expand upon the idea of redefining consumption, it talks about this requires a shift from owning products as part of an individual identity to experiencing and using products and services as part of an individual shared and collective identity. That in itself, if you're a sociologist or anthropologist, you might look at that and think, well, hold on, isn't owning products part of a collective identity already? And I would agree that it is. So I looked at that and thought, I'm not quite sure what they think that is in terms of the shift. And I'm thinking here of, a sort of work like Danny Miller's A Theory of Shopping, if you've read that, where he talks about even going into a supermarket and just looking like you're buying a loaf of bread, you are actually thinking about your family, you're thinking about thrift, you're thinking about a lot of other things. And none of that is actually individual per se, it is always collective. So that's a sort of shaky foundation to begin with. Then when we break the report down even further, it says, well, how do we get there? How do we redefine consumption? Talks about educating consumers and providing them with information, such as passports to empower, there's the word again, them for informed choices. And again, that's fine. But of course, research tells us that education per se doesn't necessarily change behaviour and practices. And labelling and putting information on or near products sometimes works. So if you have like a washing machine that uses a lot of energy in its life, we will pay attention to that. But if you're buying a cheap t-shirt, chances are you won't actually be that interested in that kind of information. It also talks about exploring the opportunities offered by less ownership biased younger generation and provide consumers with an alternative options to meet their needs. I mean, again, that is quite problematic in assuming that younger generations are less ownership biased. Often that comes down to circumstances and income rather than necessarily a life perspective. And so when younger generations may, get jobs and have families, that changes quite significantly. So we shouldn't assume that a generation embodies a particular mindset. And I'm not saying that in any critical way. Again, I just think we have to really take apart these ideas and look at where the evidence is. And the last point they suggest is support transition of governance, legal and financial systems to enable producer ownership business models. So the first part of that sentence is fantastic, and that's what the whole report is about, really. But I wonder why that then leads us down the path of just producer ownership business models. That requires some more thought on my part, but it struck me as curious. Okay, so where am I going? So what I'm arguing is that even in documents such as that report, and again, it's a great report. I'm not just sat here being, critical for the sake of it. There's a lot to be said, and I think it's really, really interesting and important that that kind of redefining of concepts is now making it into mainstream discussions and debates. It's very important. But I still feel that the foundational premise of the mainstream economic subject is kept intact if we follow those three previous steps, as I just talked about. So, as I said already, is the fundamental idea sound of experiencing and using products and services as part of an individual shared and collective identity? And I don't think that necessarily captures what needs to change, what we really need to do and address if we think this idea of circularity actually is valid. So if we are serious about an individual shared and collective identity or not, it has to go beyond renting and borrowing. So what I mean by that is I kind of read it from that phrasing, and I could be wrong, so please, if you read it differently, let me know. It assumes that if we adopt different business models like renting clothes or renting cars or whatever, that somehow that in itself engenders a shared and collective identity. But if we look at systems where there already are people sharing and renting, there is no evidence, and in fact there's evidence to the counter, that say car sharing creates a sense of connection or obligation with other users or the environment. Often it's quite the opposite. I mean, the sort of empirical research around car sharing users suggests that people tend to get a bit annoyed with the behaviour of other users because they don't clean up, they bring the car back late, etc., etc. So I'm not clear how we get to that kind of collectivity and what that actually affords us if we just go through different business models. Yeah, and as I say there, what does it mean to transition to an individual shared and collective identity? And what we're really talking about is a bit more profound than what this report and other reports and circular economy in the mainstream is talking about. So what would reshaping our collective socio-material relations require? It has to be more than efficient markets and business models and this idea of the fully informed consumer going about their business, doing what the markets want them to do, whilst at the same time being the sovereign consumers. That just doesn't add up in terms of the empirical material we have. So this is just me thinking out loud. Do we need to stop talking about the circular consumer and think about the value of other concepts? I had this moment when I was putting this together where I had this sort of existential crisis where I thought, oh no, maybe me writing about the circular consumer is just reinforcing some of the things that I'm critiquing. And there's certainly, colleagues and some great minds that have talked about the ideas of stewardship rather than consumption. And I think that's right. If we're talking about circular stewardship rather than circular consumption, what then does that do? And then when and how do we bring this into the conversation? I've just been getting involved in a project looking at environmental education for young people across the UK, and that idea of, what is school for? What is childhood for in terms of these messages and conversations has been in the back of my mind. I don't have any answers, but that's just where my thinking has been going. Anyway, I'm going to stop after this slide. Coming back to that sort of pie chart of that report, which again, I encourage you to read. It's very interesting. But that question of, even if we do manage to make this kind of superhero, circular consumer or stewardship or whatever, I'm still concerned that that won't be enough. If we think about the fact that 10% of the population cause 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, what on earth are we going to do about that? Do we assume that the uber rich are suddenly going to want to participate in the kinds of business models that take more time and take more consideration, etc.? That's an open question. We don't know, but the evidence suggests otherwise. So my final sort of thought, and this is just, me kind of work in progress as ever, is that the redefinitions of progress, prosperity, and leadership that sort of graph talks about must focus on actually redefining consumption rather than keeping its foundational premise in place. So I think we have our work cut out. And I think those sort of critical voices, and I mean constructively critical, not just, taking things apart for the sake of it, have to keep getting louder and louder in terms of the circular economy debates. Because I fear that we're heading down a path where we're feeling quite comfortable or a little bit, I was going to say smug, but that's not true, but a little bit too comfortable with a lot of the assumptions we make about the connections between our values, our identity, our practices, and how we change behaviour. So I'll stop there. So hopefully that'll give us about 15 minutes for questions, etc. So thank you. Diolch yn fawr, as we say in Wales, and danke schön, as you say there, although please excuse my pronunciation.